Good evening, everyone joining us from North America, and we also have friends who are joining us from other parts of the world, and good day to you all, and especially to our guest speaker today, Professor Stephen Matthews, who is in Hong Kong. Now, I don't know how much you know about Professor Matthews. I just felt pretty amazed when so many people signed up for today's event, and even though I'm trying to share my screen now, even though our introduction on Discord is pretty minimal. We have been able to attract so many people attending today's event, so I've come to this conclusion that Professor Matthews, you must be really famous. So Professor Matthews is indeed very well known and respected in the linguistic research community. As you can see from our very simple introduction of today's event, he and his wife, Professor Virginia Yip, who is also a linguist, wrote one of the most influential Cantonese grammar book, which is this one. And Zhang Luosi was talking about it just now before we started, right? So this is Cantonese, a comprehensive grammar, and that's the second edition. And more importantly, it's one of the very few Cantonese grammar books that was written in English. It's become an important reference for anyone who does Cantonese research, like me when I wrote my master's thesis under his supervision. And it's also a good resource for anyone learning Cantonese. Apart from this grammar book, he also co-authored a few other good workbooks for learners, like maybe this one. Let me just zoom out a little bit. Yep. So this one is for beginner level learners, and the book is well organized based on linguistic knowledge, and the chapters contain important grammar points and useful exercises. So maybe some of you already know Professor Matthew because you're learning Cantonese using these materials. Now, he's become even more famous in recent years after appearing in several interviews on YouTube and TV programs. So what makes these interviews special is that you rarely come across a white guy like him who can speak fluent Cantonese. Not only can he speak it, but he also understands the language so well. His strong passion and dedication studying and preserving Cantonese indeed warmed the hearts of many people like me who are native Cantonese speakers, and inspired me to conduct my master's research on Cantonese grammar. He and Virginia also raised their Cantonese English bilingual kids using the one parent, one language approach. And they wrote the outcomes of this research in this book. So I'm sure he'll share his insights in raising bilingual kids today. And maybe you want to ask why he decided to pick up Cantonese. I don't know if he'll talk about it today, but you can definitely go back to YouTube and check out these videos. He'll speak English mostly today, but you'll find out how fluent he is in Cantonese in these videos. And if you're a learner, it's a chance for you to practice listening as well. So, well, without further ado, let us welcome Professor Matthews, a distinguished linguist and Cantonese scholar, with a round of virtual applause. So if you can use the reaction button, I think, can we use the button there? So maybe we can use the virtual applause to welcome him. And I'll pass the floor back to Zhang Luosi to go through the agenda of today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Keith. And so from now on, we'll take a quick look at the today's agenda first. So from now on, when I'm done talking, Professor Matthews will take us on his journey of learning Cantonese. And he will also try to address some of the most commonly asked questions in the registration form. And when he is speaking, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. And we have 4 moderators that will be reading through your questions. So when Professor Matthews is done talking at 6:35, the 4 moderators will start directing questions to him. So I repeat that. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat while Professor Matthew is speaking. Okay, so now we have our, this great honor to have Professor Matthews talking to us, telling us why he learned the Cantonese, and also he will try to address some of the questions raised in the registration form. So here's Professor Matthews.
Thank you, Sigley, for the generous invitation, and Keith for the kind introduction. So, and I'm very happy to see so many people here wanting to learn more about Cantonese and keep Cantonese alive, which many of you here are contributing to. So thank you for the questions. I guess the starting point would be why Cantonese. So for me, there were a few things. It started with wanting to talk to my favorite classmate, Virginia, who became Professor Yip, and in particular, because Professor Yip was fluent in Mandarin and English. Of course, it wasn't only a matter of talking to her, it was a matter of talking to her extended family, which actually started off in North America. So it was when I met members of the extended family in San Francisco and Vancouver, it was immediately obvious that we would have to switch from Mandarin, which we had been using, to Cantonese, right? That was one aspect of it. The other aspect really was that as soon as I started, it seemed so much more interesting than Mandarin, right? Just intrinsically, in terms of how it worked, it seemed much more different from Mandarin than I expected based on my reading and so on. And it seemed very interesting for my my PhD topic at the time, which was verbal aspect, the forms of the verb, like sik jaw, sik gun, sik hoi, what do these things all mean? And that's a good example of what I just said, that Cantonese is much more interesting than Mandarin. We have things like sik hoi li gan ye la, the restaurant that I'm used to eat at, that I habitually eat at, we have what we call a habitual aspect marker. How do you do that in Mandarin? I don't know. Maybe you can. It's some variety, but it seemed like something that is not part of Mandarin grammar or of the textbooks, but it clearly is part of the Cantonese grammar. So in terms of the verbal aspect system, it just seemed a much more interesting language, and it was particularly challenging given that it was at that time we didn't really have internet. You couldn't just look these things up, right? So I had to quiz my girlfriend at the time and quiz speakers that I could come across. Like, what do you mean? Another early experience of this was in Vancouver. My wife's, probably not my wife yet, my fiance or whatever, said to me, "Sik dat wa." Right? And I said, okay, sik dat, I understand that, but what do you mean by sik dat wa? And so she said, oh, it means that my relatives have said that it's now time to eat. And I got really excited, like a linguist jumping up and down, right? Because she just indicated that this language has evidentiality in its particle system, right? And again, I had studied a little bit of Mandarin and gone through the grammar of what 7 or 8 final particles like shaba and shema, right? We have final particles, okay. But as soon as you get into intermediate Cantonese or even basic Cantonese, you discover that Cantonese is much more complicated and much more interesting than that, right? So instead of 7 or 8 particles at the end of a sentence, the goimeiti, you have 30 or 40 or 50 or hundreds of particles, depending on how you count, right? And they do really interesting things. So just like the sik hoi, it's like habitual aspect, we usually eat here. The wa, well, it's a long story, but to cut a long story short, it means this is reported by somebody else, right? And so that that meaning is a sort of abstract grammatical meaning. This the fact that it's time to eat is reported by somebody. This is a kind of evidentiality, indicating the source of the information, right? And there's something which lots of languages have, but we don't expect to find it in Chinese. So in Chuzhouwa, we don't find this. In Taiwanese, as far as I know, we don't find this. In Shanghainese, as far as I know, we don't find this. In Mandarin, you basically don't find this, but in Cantonese, we do. So these are all ways in which Cantonese immediately turned out to be interesting. About the challenge being challenging was particularly true at the time. Well, first time I went into when I came to Hong Kong, I went into bookshops and asked for books about Cantonese grammar, right? And not only did they sort of come up empty, literally we don't have that, but they even asked me questions like, Cantonese your grammar, right? The idea of Cantonese grammar was puzzling to speakers. And what they would give me, of course, would be things like word lists or phrase books, right? So that was the best I could find, really, or occasionally like teach yourself books. Whether we can talk about this, can you teach yourself Cantonese? I don't recommend it. Has anybody tried teaching yourself Cantonese?
I know I have.
Yes. How did it go?
It's okay. It's work in progress. It's still have a ways to go, but
I mean, teaching yourself in the sense that you're not interacting with a speaker.
Correct. Actually, yeah, it's been mostly consuming media, reading, and learning grammar and stuff like that.
Okay, great. So, I mean, in my day, it would have meant basically books, and if you're lucky, like cassette tapes or something like that, right? So.
Right, which is like, I think if I was learning even 5 years ago, it would have been totally different or a lot more difficult to approach. Oh, Professor, I think you are muted at this time. Thank you.
Oh. Sorry, yes, but that was interesting. So that was Michael, was it? Speaking? That was Cole. So that was Cole. Okay, right. So it's very interesting that in fact, in Cole's experience, you can teach yourself Cantonese nowadays, and that is very much thanks to the media that are out there. I mean, okay, Cantonese, but I mean, Cantonese media like news programs is not accessible to a learner, right? So you need the kind of media that can help you to learn. And I'm thinking of things like Bajio Wong. Do you know Bajio Wong and his Canto Lounge? If you haven't seen it, there's this site online called Canto Lounge, which I find very, very helpful. So, yes, and words.hk is another good example, although if you're starting from scratch, I'm not sure how useful it would be. Okay. And somebody's mentioned Canto Shake. This has also been very valuable to me. So Canto Shake, Shake is Adam Sek, right? So he's British.
Nadu hai Singapore, hai Canada, hai Agent Court, Hodo Guangdong Wa Yan, Du hai Nido, Bakong Tai Tai hai Sechuna. Not Hakan, myself. Nga Yao Ma Zhongwak Ming Nga Yu Guilo Gong. But I'm sorry, I have to switch to English. I'm still a learner. One of the things I find though about the internet is the internet sites stop at basic to low intermediate. And then you get in, then you have to go back to published material. Like they start and then for various reasons, they don't go any further, or else whoever was creating the content stopped. Maybe they've moved on with other things in their lives. So I find, and I'm lucky, I live in the Agent Court area of Scarborough, Ontario, a lot of Hong Kong expats here, but it's shifting. We're now about 50% Mandarin speakers. when it started as 90% Cantonese.
Yeah, I've experienced that as well. I grew up in Queensland, different parts of the world as well. And New York is mostly like I grew up in a modern fraction mission, and where New York was basically Cantonese families, and I would know it's made up mostly Mandarin. And he's right.
Wow, thank you for sharing. Because of time, let us get back to Professor Matthews.
Okay, so it's very interesting to hear from people, some of whom are teaching themselves, but many of the speakers that have the advantage of being surrounded by Cantonese speakers, right? So, I mean, in my experience, of course, my Cantonese learning really took off when I arrived in Hong Kong and was surrounded by particularly an extended family who actually was quite complicated because depending on the generations, they spoke Chuzhou dialect, which is quite different, as many of you know, the older generation, or they spoke Cantonese, or they spoke both Cantonese and English. So I could switch between those options, but only being surrounded by Cantonese speakers allowed my Cantonese to really take off. And my experience that he then underwent a kind of S-shaped learning curve. If you know about this S-shaped learning curve, it means that you start a bit slowly and then it really accelerates and then it slows down again. In fact, what Andrew was saying about the intermediate step might be a case of that, right? So that was my experience. One aspect of this was that as soon, I think many of you have experienced this, as soon as you can speak a bit of Cantonese as a foreigner, right, or whether it's Hong Kong or Scarborough or whatever, as soon as you can speak a few phrases, you get a lot of applause, right? You get a lot of appreciation. Like even today, but it's probably obvious that I've been here for 30 years, people still, just yesterday, I forget where I was, but somebody said, "Oh, your Cantonese is so good." It's very encouraging that whether it's good or bad, just the fact that you are using Cantonese gets you a response. It gets encouraging comments, and that really encourages you to continue. And that's not something we can take for granted, right? With other languages, I haven't really had the experience to the same extent. So I talked about going to bookstores and asking for books about Cantonese and being quite frustrated because the best that I could find was sort of phrase books or teach yourself books like I'm forgetting what it's called, the books by Sidney Lee. Like there is an intermediate, so some of you know sorry, not Sidney Lee, Sidney Lau. Some of you know these guys, the dictionary and books that he produced, which were useful in their day, but that was the best that I could find. And so you may have heard this story before, but I started making notes on everything that I discovered from my in-laws, right? Like the particle war or the aspect marker hoi. I started making notes on this, and at some point, quite quickly, actually, because of the state of the art in those days, quite quickly I realized that even if I just published my notes, they would be an advance on what was available when I started to learn Cantonese. Right? This is why this is how we came up with the idea of the Cantonese grammar and then proposed it to Routledge. So this kind of gap, it's like finding a huge research gap when you're doing your PhD. There's a big gap there, was rather obvious at the time, and that led to Cantonese grammar and then the basic and intermediate Cantonese books. Okay, I'm seeing some relevant questions in the chat. Yes, perhaps I should explain about the characters. So when we first produced the Cantonese grammar, we talked about characters, and the publishers in London, Routledge, said that if we put in characters, that's going to double the price of the book. And the book was already quite expensive, as you may have felt. It has always been expensive. So at the time, it would have been twice as expensive with the characters. So we gave them up. By the time of the second edition, the technology had moved on, right? And it was, so I mean, in the 1990s, it was very difficult to create Cantonese characters, right? We didn't really have the expertise. Very few people had the expertise to do that, right? Whereas by the time we did the second edition around 2010, the Cantonese characters were widely available online. Yeah. So there's a question about Kun Sui. I don't know much about that. Multiracial individuals, yeah, this is a growing question. This is exactly what our children are experiencing, right? So are you British or Chinese or American or what? So my children now live in US or Canada, right? So they're having a kind of multi-ethnic, multilingual identity, right? And this can work both ways. I mean, if they are viewed as outsiders to the Chinese community, or if they're viewed as foreigner, then again they will get applause for speaking Cantonese fluently. But if they are viewed as basically Chinese or having come from Hong Kong, they may get questioned for their funny Cantonese or the fact that they can't write a letter in Chinese, right? So there's a lack of literacy or so on. And so that can be that could work both ways. So I have a question about the Aktionsart. Is this Joe? So yes, Aktionsart is to do with the category of verbal aspect. It's not quite as simple as that, but I don't think we quite have time for a lecture here. Right, so I think Joe is asking about the relationship between the aspect markers like which everybody agrees are perfective aspect and progressive aspect. What's the relationship between those and things like yun and do, as in do or do, right? Yun meaning finishing it. Yes, so we can describe this in linguistic terms by saying that the addition of a resultative particle forms an accomplishment predicate. The Tanti is another very nice example. I can see people see the just repeat the what we call in our grammar we call it the adversative tan. Do you know what I mean by something like ditunga tan? So we're talking about the adversative tan, and I would just say that this is another example of sort of one of our my wife's discovery. This one that as a linguist she realized we have this tan, and it's puzzling because it means it means things like BBD tan, and something means adversity means something bad happened to the baby, right? The BBD tan. And again, if we ask how do we do this in written Chinese, or how do we do this in Mandarin or Putonghua, seems like we can't, and it's more complicated than that because there's also the habitual chan, as like so that means every time that he speaks he talks about the same stuff. So is that one tan or two tans? I don't know, what are they doing? So my wife actually wrote an article about this. It's not very well known, but somewhere in the journal Concentric, she has an article about this particle tan. Yeah. But it's another example of what I was saying, why Cantonese is so interesting and so it remains, despite the sort of mushrooming of interest in recent years, it remains understudied and not well understood. And at the moment, my most popular course is Cantonese linguistics. I have like 50 or 60 students every time. And I make this same point every time, that relatively simple things about Cantonese, like the question Joe is asking, like what is the meaning, or what is the grammar of dou, as in zhou dou, right? To manage to do something, right? To do something successfully, zhou dou, right? How do we describe that grammatically? My usual answer is we need a thesis. We need a good thesis about this, right? And another thing that I like to say, particularly has put my grammar book on the background slide for today's talk. Another thing I like to say is, if we open that grammar book at any page, you have about one page on each topic, right? So maybe on the adversative particle ton, maybe we have one page on that, but you could easily write a whole thesis about this particle. And in that case, maybe somebody hasn't, but in some cases somebody has, right? So I forget what's a good example, but there are lots of pages in the grammar that have turned into particles. In fact, Joe Punholoi, exactly. This is a good example. So in our Cantonese grammar, there's one or two pages about the word ya, as in what is it? So I mean, as soon as he gets caught, or if he gets caught, right? So what does this yak mean, or what does it do? And Joe has just finished a brilliant thesis about this topic, which he's now about to publish. So stay tuned. But it's a perfect example of what I wanted to say, which is that any of the sections of grammar, of any of the sections of our grammar could be a thesis topic, and some of them have been made into thesis topics and paper topics. Yeah. Okay. We're getting many more questions in the chat than I can answer. Have I answered the question about my learning experience? Maybe I've said most of what's relevant about that. So I was helped by being surrounded by speakers. Now, one of the ways to learn Cantonese, as many of you know, is sort of a standing joke, if you like, is to have a significant other, such as a boyfriend or girlfriend or fiance who speaks the language. And this course only works if the fiance, if the fiance is willing to speak the language, right? So I've heard from some people that, I don't know, dating a beautiful Cantonese girl, but she speaks English all the time, right? So that will not work. So you need to have some kind of agreement with your significant other. It might be that we aim to speak 50-50 or something, right? Share our languages and speak half English, half Cantonese. Or it might be that we aim to speak Cantonese as default. And that is basically the situation that we got into with my wife, and still the case until today, that we speak Cantonese for everyday purposes, and we switch into English as the marked case. We switch into English when we have a difficult linguistic analysis to discuss, or when we're having an argument and she wants to make sure that for some reason, when we're having an argument, it tends to move into English. I'll leave others to explain why that is. But the important point is that we set into a mode where Cantonese was the default language, and that was easier by being in Hong Kong, but it also happened while we were in Vancouver, which is quite Cantonese rich place. Right? So we were able to keep that going. And that was the main source of my Cantonese improving, if you like. Now that enabled me to speak Cantonese. As to how I learned to read Cantonese, that's not so easy. So at the time, I was very much under the influence of Stephen Krashen. Some of you will know him, but I will put him in the chat, right? Stephen Krashen, one of our professors at USC, and he's famous for believing in acquisition, not learning, right? So learning means like consciously teaching or going to a class. Acquisition means like absorbing a language like a child does, right? And at the time, I was very much under his influence, and I believed that I could learn to speak without taking any formal courses, which was true. I also believed that I could acquire Chinese literacy by acquisition. Now, was I right? Well, yes, but I would say I was right, but it took me many years. It took me it was very long, laborious. So it would have been more efficient to take some lessons in in reading and writing Chinese, whereas I insisted on trying to acquire it. So how did I acquire it? I acquired it through popular Cantonese novels, like I've talked in various interviews about the series Su Liao Mian Zhao Gei. It was originally the script for a Cantonese radio play, and it was made into movies, and it was so popular that the script was published, right? So you got these pocket novels that I was able to read. Now, by virtue of being a fluent Cantonese speaker, I was able to follow most of what was going on in those novels and to acquire Cantonese literacy in Cantonese that way. The result was that I became able to read Cantonese, but not the newspaper, right? Because the newspaper is not written in Cantonese. So, I mean, I still struggle to read newspapers, right? Because I never took formal Chinese literacy classes. So, I mean, in retrospect, I should have done, but I was sort of doggedly sticking to acquisition, and I was able to acquire Chinese literacy, but it took a long time and it was not very efficient. So I mean, I still recommend reading those. So somebody asked about intermediate level or getting beyond basic or beyond intermediate. One way is definitely to read Cantonese literature. There were some questions about Cantonese literature in the chat. I have a few things to share. So can you see this journal, Wei Heng? This is a journal of Yip Man, right? Yip Man Hok, written Cantonese. This is an excellent source of written Cantonese short stories, even poems. You have what we call you see we have new Cantonese poetry there. And just yesterday, for various reasons, I went to Mongkok to look for Cantonese literature, and I succeeded. The immediate reason I went, let me show you. The immediate reason I went to Mongkok was to sorry, struggling with Zoom as usual. Can you see this book? Right, so the next volume of this novel that I've talked about a lot, because to me it definitely is a Cantonese novel. Right? It's as a novel, it's more complex and more interesting than the previous pocket novels like Su Lam and Zhao Gei. Right? So this is the kind of thing you can read. It is written basically in in pure Cantonese, the Cantonese as it's spoken, right? Not just the dialogue, but the narrative as well, right? So that is one. And in the process, I found lots of other Cantonese literature that I can share later if you like. That was one of the main ways in which I progressed from just speaking to being able to read Cantonese, and that was really my way into Chinese literacy. Okay, so Sidley is asking now about having a bilingual family, right? As soon as we knew we were having a family, the question of language policy came up, right? So there is a thing called family language policy. We actually have articles about this family language policy. It's quite important. The word policy is slightly mislead. Oh, sorry. Okay. By the way, I'm seeing lots of questions about phonology, but it's not really my strength. So I apologize for not picking the questions on phonology. I probably don't have a good answer on those. But Sigley has asked me to talk about the bilingual children. So we agreed on a language policy which is one parent, one language. That was what we adopted. Each parent speaks their native language to the child. Now, this is not the only way to have bilingual children, but at the time it seemed like a good way, and even today it's quite a good way. One way to have bilingual children. It is not foolproof. So interestingly, according to the research, one parent, one language is 75% effective. That means something like the COVID vaccine, right? It means that in 3/4 of the cases, one parent, one language produces bilingual children, right? Now, you may well wonder, what about the other 25%? And it's a good question, but don't have a good answer to that. So we can come back to that if you like. But we followed the one parent, one language approach, and it was pretty effective in producing bilingual children. So we have 3 children that are still fluent in both languages, right? They didn't really achieve Chinese literacy. That's another story, right? But is in terms of spoken language, they achieve bilingualism, right? And Sean is asking a very good question. Now, can you see Sean's question? What is the latest research on benefits of raising a bilingual child? And we didn't know this at the time. This is something very new, right? And Paul's just wrote a relevant question as well. So what was discovered, even when we wrote a book about the bilingual children, we wrote about their experience going up bilingual. We didn't know at the time about the advantage. Well, we knew about practical advantages. We didn't know about the cognitive advantages of being bilingual, which is a boom area of research recently, right? It's somewhat controversial, but it's a new finding. And most of the research shows that bilingual children are better at certain things, not everything. But I mean, the short version is bilingual children are smarter. It's a little bit misleading. Bilingual children are better at certain kinds of tasks, particularly something like multitasking tasks, or tasks which involve changing what you do. So if you're playing a game with the children and you ask them to change the rules, so we're playing a slightly different game, bilingual children are much better at doing that than monolingual children, right? So it's just one example of the kind of tasks that they're better at. There's some interesting evidence that the bilingual children are more creative. right? So if you ask a question like, okay, here's an empty water bottle, what could we do? With a list of things that we could do with this empty water bottle, the bilingual children tend to come up with more, with a longer list and more creative things that you can do. And that's interesting because it's not at all obvious, right? So there are those advantages. And of course, for many of you, the big advantage of having bilingual children is that you'll be maintaining Cantonese. I prefer not to talk about preserving Cantonese because that's something that you do. Preserve something, it sounds like it's in a museum, right? That it's static, right? But maintaining Cantonese means continuing to use it, right? And so we can contribute to that by talking Cantonese to our children. Now, some people had asked questions like, what if I don't speak much Cantonese? And my answer would be, go ahead, speak what Cantonese you can, speak the Cantonese that you can, and that will still result in some degree of bilingualism, right? Now, bilingualism is a continuum, right? There's no way no way out of that, right? Some people have said, how do I achieve native-like bilingual? How do I achieve native-like proficiency as a bilingual or for my bilingual children? I would try not to think of it that way, right? Because, I mean, it can happen, but achieving native-like proficiency in both languages is quite rare, I would say, right? Maybe it can happen if you stick to it and the conditions are perfect, but the conditions rarely are perfect. So, I mean, I talked about one parent, one language, but an obvious problem with that is, does it result in 50-50 distribution of the two languages? No. So we estimated that for my children, it was more like 70-30, because although Virginia was speaking to the children in Cantonese and I was speaking in English, the children were in an extended family environment with lots of people speaking to them in Cantonese and only me and sometimes a Filipino helper speaking to them in English, right? So even with one parent, one language, you're not looking at a balanced bilingual environment. So for many of you in North America, it'll be the opposite problem, right? So maybe it's 70% English or 75% English. Do we know, I mean, there is a kind of rule of thumb in the literature that says bilingual children need at least 30% input in the other language, but it's not very scientific. It's just a rule of thumb. So we will count the child as being in a bilingual environment if they have at least 30% of the minority language, but there's nothing magic about the 30%, right? So if you're having, say, 20 or 25% Cantonese in your environment, then you're probably going to become some kind of heritage speaker, right? But that's Hoguomo, as we say, it's a lot better than none, right? And we know that heritage speakers have a huge advantage. So even if you just heard some Cantonese as a child, even if you stop speaking it, then you have a huge advantage, right? Which is that if you then go to live in a Cantonese community or marry a full Cantonese speaker or whatever, you are able to, you have a huge head start in learning the language or speaking the language later, right? There was a nice example of that, not with Cantonese, but with Mandarin. If I can share something, I want to find a paper that I published recently. So let me try to share this. This is a paper that I published with Audrey Lee from USC, just appeared in the Journal of Chinese Linguistics. If you have difficulty finding this, I would be glad to send you a copy. And it's called Turning the Tide. It's about a family of heritage speakers in which the parents, or the second generation, the parents of the small children had themselves stopped speaking Chinese. They just grown up as sort of ABCs speaking Mandarin to each other. But when they themselves had small children, they wanted to speak Chinese to the children, and then they faced the problem. Oh, our Mandarin, it is Mama Day. With Mama Day Chinese, can we still speak that to our children? And they decided that they would. And what they did was to basically revitalize their own Chinese, their own Mandarin in this case, within the marriage, right, and speak more Mandarin to each other. And they brought in the elder generation of grandparents, right? Some of you are saying your Cantonese is not good enough, but I expect you have aunts and uncles and parents or grandparents whose Cantonese is good enough. So if you can just bring them in by Zoom or something, like drop in Zoom segment from grandma or something, then you're transforming the children's environment so that they have much more effective Chinese or Cantonese input, right? So this is basically a success story in that the parent generation was able to resume their Chinese learning, and they were able to pass it on to their young children. So we think of that as a nice success story.
Hi, Professor. I just wanted to chime in here just to summarize some of the questions we've received when
Great. Yes, thank you.
Up. And so I think you've already answered a lot of them. To synthesize, a lot of the questions were about what you already answered. It was about, we're unfortunately not so close to Mongol, those in North America, and they're not surrounded by those, if you will, that free immersion. And so there were a lot of folks are interested in, how they are themselves not confident in their Cantonese. How do we do that one parent, one language approach? And that will that still work? And I think having that number, in mind, that delineates 20 to 25 or 30% is helpful, and it's new to me. I wanted to also, bring up another question we received, which was this. How do you feel about the ethno-linguistic vitality of Cantonese in overseas communities? For example, in Europe, in North America, in Canton, and in the mainland, apart from Hong Kong.
Right. So I could talk about Vancouver and mainland. So I've been going to Canton, Guangzhou now for 30 years. Actually not a lot, but maybe the fact that I don't go that often is useful, because from one visit to another, I can experience the decline of Cantonese in Guangdong province, right? My students have also reported this, that they go and teach English in a small town in Guangdong, and they find that the young children there teaching English, they don't even speak Cantonese anymore, right? So we do experience the decline. When I go to Shenzhen, I try to speak Cantonese, but very often I find that the people in Shenzhen, they're from somewhere else in China, and they haven't learned any Cantonese, right? So, so Shenzhen is maybe a special case, and I don't perceive very much vitality of Cantonese there. Sadly, I perceive a decline in Guangzhou. Whenever I go, there was sort of pockets of resistance. My students recently told me that schools in Guangdong have instituted a dialect day, so that on Fridays they sort of loosen up and welcome students to talk dialect, right? So there was a little bit of a backlash, a little bit of pushback against the loss of dialects, when people it's like all over the world. When people actually realize that a language is endangered, then you start to see some kinds of pushback revitalization efforts, but that tends to affect only a minority of the population, right? So meanwhile, the decline of the language is continuing. That's my experience. Vancouver is a different case. It is interesting that again, I've been going there for 30 years, so it goes up and down. when I first went there around 1990, the vitality of Cantonese was extraordinary. Like, so Richmond was basically a Cantonese speaking environment, right? Then I found that around 2010, 2015, Mandarin seemed to be taking over, and I seemed to be seeing a lot of language shifts. So I could see families that had emigrated to Canada from Hong Kong, and they were shifting to Mandarin for lots of purposes, like, okay, maybe their church operated in Mandarin, or maybe their kindergarten was available in Mandarin but not in Cantonese, right? There were lots of these sort of practical pressures that were leading families to basically give up on Cantonese and say, oh, well, at least we still have Chinese, we can still keep our Chineseness by going to a Cantonese school or something, but that would tend to lose the Cantonese. Recently, there is, because there's a new wave of immigration to Canada, so in my last few visits, the Cantonese have seemed more vital again in Vancouver. Vancouver and Toronto, I think, are rather special cases because they do have the critical mass of people and interest in education, right, to support the Cantonese revival. So now the UBC is like one of the leading programs in the world, for maybe the leading program for teaching Cantonese to heritage speakers and others. So that's very impressive. It is sometimes said that Vancouver will take over as the Cantonese speaking capital of the world as declines. It declines slowly in Hong Kong. We haven't really talked about that yet, but in my view, we are seeing a slow decline of Cantonese in Hong Kong, a gradual shift to Putonghua and to English. Somebody's just asking, what does the decline look like in Hong Kong? It has been, I mean, it's happening, but it's been quite gradual, so quite insidious in the way that language shift typically is, right? Stepwise. So in the surveys, you get things like the number of people saying that they can speak Cantonese. It goes down from 89% to 88% to 87%, like from one survey to another, right? So a few years ago, everybody started asking, is Cantonese an endangered language? And I said, well, the short answer is yes, but for the long answer, and yes, I actually quoted the case of like Richmond moving from very much Cantonese to mixed Cantonese and Mandarin and other languages. In Hong Kong, it's not very obvious. So what I did, I came to use the language endangerment index, which is by John Van Wei and Nala Lee. They were in Hawaii, now they're in, or she is in Singapore, and what they propose is a number of measures for is a language endangered, and one of them is the proportion of speakers declining. And as I just said, it is, but it's so gradually that it's not obvious, right? Another way to look at it is sort of case studies of individual families. So we are seeing language shift, which is the process of moving away from communities or families moving away from a certain language. And what I like to point to is individual families where we can see the language shift happening, right? So I talk about the A family because many of them are called A, and in the A family, we find, for example, they have two girls, and the elder girl is very bilingual or multilingual. She speaks Cantonese fluently, but the younger girl does not. The younger girl speaks English to her helpers and Putonghua at school. And even though the parents do speak Cantonese to her, she responds in English or Mandarin, right? So, I mean, that's a common pattern that the elder children speak more Cantonese than the younger ones, right? So, and then the question is, what about their children, right? So, will these children's children speak Cantonese? Probably not, unless something changes, right? Unless they have a kind of aha moment in which they realize, oh, I'm from Hong Kong, I should speak Cantonese, and maybe things will change. But unless something changes, then some of these families will be gradually shifting. Okay.
And
Michael, did you want, or the moderators like to
sure. I think that leads into actually in terms of like decline. I think that leads into the question, or the kind of the series related questions I was going to ask, having to do with standardization of the language. And
yes,
you think that's a necessary step to kind of promote it and like promote literacy, promote education, and yeah, pretty much.
Yes, I agree. Right. So this has been one of the frustrations of learning Cantonese, and most of you, or maybe all of you, have experienced this. How do you write Cantonese? In fact, I remember the first time I talked about this in Hong Kong, one of the first times that I went to a conference, a linguistics conference in Hong Kong. What I propose is that we should teach linguistics by having students analyze Cantonese, which is what I do now with my Cantonese linguistics course. And one of the senior colleagues said, well, that's all very well, Steve, but for a start, how are you going to write? How are you going to represent Cantonese? It's a mess, right? And in that time, it was a huge mess, right? Like all of the romanization systems. Even those days, it was even bigger mess. You could count like 50 or so different romanization systems in use. Right? So there was a huge need for standardization, and the Linguistic Society of Hong Kong agreed. Actually, after this conference, it all sort of blew up, and we agreed that we needed to standardize a system. So that's how we came up with the Linguistic Society of Hong Kong Yip Ping romanization system. Now, we proposed that, and it worked in the sense that linguists now use this in Hong Kong, and to a large extent they use it around the world, right? So it's just that it is a successful standardization among linguists, but that doesn't really answer your question, right? In other words, having linguists standardize is a step in the right direction, but it's not really a big deal until we can get the standardization out there into the community, right? So now, yesterday in my trip to Mongkok, I found something else interesting. Maybe I can show you. I found this set of Hong Kong wildlife cards, which is teaching children about the wildlife and the birds of Hong Kong. And this is one of the iconic raptors of Hong Kong, the crested serpent eagle. And this is just teaching the word eagle, and it has written the words in Yutpeng at the top, right? So somehow the producers of this set of cards has got the message about Yutpeng. Actually, I should ask them. I should get online and find these people who have produced it. Let me just share the set so that some of you may want to buy this for your children. I'm going to actually give this to various people as a Christmas present, right? Can you see the Hong Kong wildlife cards? And I will just put in the chat where you can get them. You can get them from anddear.com, right? And I don't yet know these people, but I want to get in touch and ask them how they were able to use Yutpeng. So that's just a nice example of Yutping being in the community, we occasionally see this in advertising as well, right? And again, I'm not quite sure why, but somehow the Yutping romanization has got out there into the community, and it sometimes appears in things like advertisements, right? So that's a step towards standardization. Meanwhile, there is the problem of character standardization, right? And a point I like to make in oh, thank you for that. Siri can pronounce Yuping. I didn't know that. Yeah, character standardization, a point I make in my courses is that the Hong Kong government, whether it's the colonial government or the current government, has always had a laissez-faire attitude to Cantonese, which I translate as 當佢冇道. 政府嘅態度就係當佢冇道, right? Treat it as if it doesn't exist, right? There's always been the attitude to Cantonese. There's never been any interest in standardizing either characters or romanization, which is unfortunate. On the other hand, Cantonese writers have an ability to do a kind of de facto standardization, right? In other words, how do these novelists like Sit Horzeng, how do they arrive at this quasi-standard way of writing characters? It's not quite clear to me how, but they do, right? At least within Hong Kong, within like the Golden Forum, the Hong Kong writers community, they do. And then people like Bob Bauer in his dictionary have adopted the most common versions, and websites like Hampalang and words.hk have helped a lot to promote these. Sorry, I see we're slightly running out of time. Would any of the moderators like to choose topics that we haven't addressed?
I think we've covered pretty much all the questions, right? And if you have a particular question that you really want to ask Professor Matthews now, you can put that in the chat.
Yes, could one of the moderators collect all of these things that have gone into that? I think you will do by the recording, but make sure you collect all the questions in the chat, and we can come back to them in various ways.
So there's one question about the official word for bei, right? It's the character. So
that is an interesting question. The word official, right? The problem just now is that there isn't an official. There was only a de facto agreement. So, I mean, in this community, if we could establish some agreement, that would be helpful. I think this is a complicated case, right, Jackson, because the usage, I think what Jackson found is that depending on whether you mean bei to give or bei as in a grammatical marker of passives and so on, the usage is actually different. And then the problem with that is that there were some intermediate cases which are like intermediate in the grammaticalization pathway between give and permit and passive marking, right? So there were some intermediate cases that would always be uncertain, right? So that is a particularly difficult case. So there's a reason why there is uncertainty there. But the problem is that there's still no such thing as official, right? I was going to say, could we ask the current government, the current Hong Kong government, be careful what I say, but I'm not optimistic about asking them to get into standardizing Cantonese. we haven't talked about the lazy tones. The short answer is that linguists view lazy tones as sound changes in progress, right? And there's a lot of research on this. And there is what we call tone mergers. It means lan yam. So linguists talk about this as a kind of sound change, and it doesn't bother us. I know it does bother some speakers, but my short answer would be that short answer is that you better not waste your time worrying about it, because you cannot fight sound changes. It's like it's a losing battle, right?
Professor Matthews, living in Canada, I can actually see this sort of language shift in Canada. Where I'm from had a very strong regional accent. It actually had quite a, where I'm originally from in Eastern Ontario, had a strong hint of an Irish brogue in it. Moving down here, my sons, their mother was Cantonese, but where we live in Scarborough, their accent and the vocabulary they're using in their everyday lives is starting to take on definite Americanisms. So language shift is happening right now, and I don't like the term lazy, because otherwise you and I should be speaking like William Shakespeare wrote if we want to talk about lazy.
Yes, I mean, as a linguist, I agree. I understand that some people have strong feelings about this, but basically I agree that all languages are changing, including in their sounds and in their grammar. We didn't get to talk about that. I was planning to talk about how Cantonese has changed even in the time that I've been studying it. And the sound changes have continued, the tone mergers have continued, and even grammatical changes have happened. So this is all natural, and basically trying to stop a language from changing is a losing battle, as I said.
I wanted to just jump in there and just to do a time check. I know that some people may have different engagements to run to, and Dr. Matthews, I'm not sure if you have any yamcha appointments later today.
Actually, I do. I have, maybe I should mention this, I have a lunch with Lei Yinping, Cream Li, and Xin Kataoka, Ping Gong Sang, who I would like to mention. Somebody asked, where's the intermediate learning materials? Well, my favorite intermediate learning material is the book Lai Mai Tin Chang, the book Wedding Bells by Kataoka and Li.
I was just about to mention, yes.
If you have difficulty getting hold of it, I'm about to have lunch with them. So I'm sure we can arrange that if anybody needs a copy. Right? It's brilliant because there was a CD to go with it. You can listen to it and follow the text. So this is a brilliant intermediate learning material.
But yours and Professor Yip's intermediate is also a wonderful learning tool.
Oh, thank you, Andrew.
Yes, Cheng Lo Si, would you like to say a few words about the the Cantonese Alliance and then the Discord community at this time?
Sure, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank Professor Matthews for chatting with us tonight, and also thank you for everyone for attending this event. And it really has been fun and insightful. And I feel so touched when Professor Matthews talk about all these interesting linguistic features. Because as a native speaker, as native speakers, we tend to take take things for granted. So he has reminded us how precious the language is, and he has brought up so many important topics that we can actually continue in many conversations. We can continue to talk about them for a long time. So I have actually typed the Discord link. So I want to invite everyone to join us on Discord. The Cantonese Alliance mission is to promote and to maintain Cantonese by bringing, all the Cantonese enthusiasts together. You can be parents or learners or content creators or teachers or any community members. So please come and join us. And we will use that channel to connect with each other. And also we'll be announcing a lot more events. And actually, at the beginning of this talk, I was joking with Professor Matthews that we should invite Professor Yip to come here and talk to us too. And then some of you might have attended to talk about memes and identity. So I am actually in touch with Professor Gina Tom, who wrote about dialects and nationalism. So, so there are a lot of talks that are, that are being planned. In addition, we'll also be offering courses. And one of the attendees made a very good point by saying that there is a lack of materials for intermediate to advanced learners. And the Cantonese Alliance actually is currently creating a lot of very relevant materials, relevant meaning relevant to the Cantonese diaspora. For example, we have started a Chinatown project. We actually visited Chinatown. The first one is Los Angeles Chinatown. We're creating a lot of materials that would be highly relevant and critical to the Cantonese diaspora. So, so to conclude here, because we are actually 7-11, 7-11, and so I really want to invite everyone to join us. If you haven't done that, please join us on Discord. And if you can stay for a little bit longer, we're very happy to chat with you for another 10 minutes or so. But I understand Professor Matthews has to go and yum cha with his friends, right? Yes. So so that's all I have to say. And Michael, I can still see you on the screen. Do you have anything to add? Actually, Michael is one of our directors. We had a board of directors, and Michael is one of us on the Cantonese Alliance. So do you have anything to add?
Nope.
Nope.
Yeah.
And yes, and also I'm sorry because I know Raymond is here because Professor Matthews was talking about Vancouver being the future capital of Cantonese, and we have the coordinator of the Cantonese program at UBC with us. So if you have time to stay, and if Raymond also has time to stay, he can actually say a few words about it. Hey, Raymond, are you still there? I saw you earlier.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I'm not in front of camera. I just washed my hair, so, but I'm here.
Okay, would you like to tell us a little bit about your program and what you're doing down there? I mean, up there actually. You're north of California.
I guess the easiest way is I just give you the link to our program, our website. Yeah, feel free to check it out and feel free to contact me too. I'll give you my email.
Yes, and so yes, I noticed that there's still 65 people stay here. So if you want to chat and ask us questions, we'll be very happy to answer. Oh, Professor Matthews, are you still there?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Oh, so a lot of people had asked you to share the article about the your
language shift
by Audrey Lee and
yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me try to. I could share it onto the chat while we're continuing the chat. It'll take me a few minutes, probably to do that. But in the meantime, I'm happy to continue chatting.
Okay, so we will. What about we'll check another 5 to 10 minutes? Would that be okay with you, Professor Matthews? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So please keep asking him questions, and then we'll end at like 7:20. 7:20. Okay, Raymond has posted the UBC Cantonese link.
So Professor Matthews, it's Andrew O'Connor again. How do you feel about William McNaughton's works for trying to get a handle on reading and writing Chinese characters?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't think I know that. Yeah, I mean, I know of them, but I haven't used them, I'm afraid. So has that been useful to you?
It is. It is. It is. I mean, today's world of ebooks, it's a little easier because I have it as ebook, and I'm going to say I've have it as an ebook for nefarious purposes because I can crack ebooks. So what I do is I insert the Cantonese readings where it has the Mandarin. And then I
Oh,
notate,
right. Yes.
and then I notated
mhm.
about dialectical usage either, like the Mandarin particle na also functions for the Cantonese locator, like the proximal locator ni. So I just make little notations and glosses like that, and like I said, I amend it by adding Cantonese readings.
Yeah, may I?
Great. I heartily approve. Adding
May I
yeah.
jump in here?
Mm.
Yeah, I have something very exciting to share with you.
Mhm.
So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so the Cantonese Alliance is actually developing a curriculum for reading and writing. So I have defined 4 stages, but I'm going to show you this one. This is stage 3. So watch. So these are stories from Hambalan. So I think many of you are familiar with the stories. They are in Cantonese, and you can go to their website and you can download the entire story. They have even made audios and videos available for free. And one of our volunteers, Dennis, has created this tool. So can you all see? When I hover over a character, you can see the stroke order. And also you can choose to see either Yale or Yiping. And you can also, you have all these buttons that you can choose. So at stage 3, we are going to use Hambalan's books integrated with Dennis's, stroke order tool. And then so there are all sorts of interesting things. And at stage 1, now here's stage 1, so we'll start with basic radicals and so on, basic principle, and the first 600 most common characters. And actually, Cole is with us today. He's one of our moderators. So he has created a deck of 2,000 characters. So I will pick out 600 characters from his deck. And again, they're all supported by romanization, and also there's an audio file. So I just want to say that we are working on this. So I hope by January, we can make an announcement that we can start offering at least the first 3 stages. Yeah, does it look exciting? And Cole is here if Cole wants to say a few words about your deck.
Sure, yeah, I'll just say clarify, I guess. So right now it's in progress. It's a Cantonese deck. It's going to be 2,000 words, kind of. It's going to teach you one new element each card. So it starts off with words, then it starts off with phrases, and then it goes into sentences. So it'll have a word and then a sentence on the front. And then you have to so testing you on the meaning of one specific meaning of that word. And it does that. There's 2,000 cards. And so there's also really useful notes about grammar and particles. And there's also going to be audio, word audio, and then hopefully I'll add sentence audio, but I'll have to pay somebody to record all the sentences. So I think that will be a really, really powerful resource for learners, but it's still in progress.
Yes, and I am also very excited to, I'm actually trying to share 2 tools with you, but the internet is very slow. So now it's like on one hand, we feel that, Cantonese is being threatened. On the other hand, there has been a revival of Cantonese in the Cantonese diaspora, and it is being pushed by the 2nd or the 3rd generation, because it's now time for them to raise their children. And then all of a sudden they feel that, I am not comfortable with Cantonese. Then does it mean that my children cannot, will not be able to inherit Cantonese from me? So they have been behind this revitalization of Cantonese, and they have created a lot of very creative materials. So let me see if I can, I still cannot. I'm trying to get into, so basically what I'm trying to say is there are 2 tools that are very handy. One of them is an online pop-up dictionary. So if you are reading anything, any Chinese characters, and you hover over any characters, you will be able to see right there the meaning of the characters. And then the other one actually will add romanization. I believe it's Yuping, only Yuping, to all the Cantonese all the Chinese characters that you see on your screen. So so basically what I'm trying to say is there's so much creativity out there now that we can actually combine technology with contents to make materials more interesting and more accessible to a very large population of Cantonese learners. Okay, I can tell that it's 7:21 now. So Professor Matthews, would you like to say one last thing to us?
Well, thank you all for joining in and staying. Special thanks to Sigley and Keith and Michael and colleagues for running this so nicely. I'm sorry that we were only able to pick a subset of questions, but we could do something like this again. We could do a Matthews and Yip show, or we could do a Yip show as Sigley mentioned, and we actually, you could ask most of the same questions to Professor Yip, as well as more questions on the bilingualism and heritage language side.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Matthews. It really has been our honor to have you here tonight. And your wealth of knowledge and your experiences have been very valuable to us. So we hope to see you again, and also Professor Yip. And for the attendance, yes, let us continue our conversations on Discord. And I want to wish you, if you live in North America, I want to wish you a good night. And if you live elsewhere, have a good morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.